When a horrific crime takes place, all the community wants is for the crime to be solved and justice to be served. Sadly, for a handful of cases, this is not the reality. Many cases will sit on the desks of detectives going cold for many years before they're even re-examined. With advances in forensic technology and investigation techniques, many cases get a second chance at being solved. Here are 5 decades-old cases that were recently solved. Number 5. This first case takes us back to 1916, making it the oldest case that the DNA Doe Project has ever solved. Joseph Henry Lovelace was an Idaho outlaw who escaped from his prison cell in 1916. Following his escape, he murdered his wife only to be placed back into jail and escaped once again. After his final prison escape in 1916, Lovelace was never heard from again, something that his family said was unusual. His daughter told a reporter, "Papa never stayed in jail very long and he'll be out soon." Time passed and his family never did hear from him again. They assumed that Lovelace had escaped from prison and moved to Idaho in the hopes of starting a new life. However, the truth was far more disturbing. Lovelace's case remained dormant until 1979, over 63 years later. On August 26, 1979, a family were digging for arrowheads in a network of volcanic caves in eastern Idaho when they made the grisly discovery. The family found the headless torso of a man buried in a shallow grave. It wasn't until 1991 when a mummified hand, an arm, and 2 legs wrapped in burlap sacks were found, all belonging to the Doe. With no quick way of making a formal identification, he simply became known as the Clark County John Doe. Researchers and investigators alike were stumped at the possible identity of the Doe without the head being present. They were having a very hard time making any progress on identification. With no composite sketches or other estimates to go on, they turned to the DNA Doe Project, an all-volunteer organization that works with law enforcement agencies to provide cutting-edge forensic techniques. When working on this Doe, the DNA Doe Project found that a sample of DNA from his tibia was high quality and was viable for further testing. This is extremely rare in cases as old as this one, as DNA degrades over time. Samantha Blatt, who is a bioarchaeologist at the Idaho State University, commented that the preservation of his DNA could have been down to the temperature of the cave being so low, at 2 degrees Celsius, that it helped preserve his body. With a DNA profile, the process of sifting through thousands of profiles on numerous databases began. Beyond DNA, which is a database that matches DNA to family trees, proved to be the most useful. After scoring through archives, researchers came across the wanted poster for Joseph Henry Lovelace. After comparing the clothes that the Doe was found in with those listed on the wanted poster, a light-colored hat, brown coat, red sweater, blue overalls, and black trousers, researchers were confident that they had their match. The final step was to track down a living relative of Lovelace. They tracked down his 87-year-old grandson, who was more than happy to provide a DNA sample for comparison, and to everyone's surprise, it was a match. The Clark County John Doe, who'd been killed in 1916, was confirmed to be Joseph Henry Lovelace, and for over 103 years, Lovelace remained unidentified until 2019, when, thanks to genealogical DNA, he was able to get his identity back. While the circumstances around his death remain a mystery, Lovelace's case has now become the oldest to ever be solved through genealogical DNA, giving hope to thousands of families around the world in their fight for justice for their loved one. Number 4. Leslie Perloff was a bright and aspiring law student at Stanford University in California. At the time of her murder, Leslie was just 21 years old and had her whole life ahead of her. But sadly, this was tragically cut short. On February 13, 1973, Leslie was working at the North County Law Library in Palo Alto at around 3 p.m. when she got into her 1972 orange Chevrolet Nova before disappearing. It wouldn't be until 3 days later when her body was found face down and strangled in an old quarry. For years, Leslie's case sat dormant, haunting investigators. Many thought that serial killer Ted Bundy was responsible, as just days before his execution, he'd alluded to the murder of a young woman in Palo Alto, but none of this could be confirmed via evidence. Justice for Leslie didn't come until 2018, when a team of cold case detectives gave the evidence another look over. This examination proved fruitful as they recovered the DNA of an unknown male from Leslie's body. In July of 2018, Palo Alto detectives reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, who were pioneers in the field of forensic genealogy and DNA testing. They harnessed the power of DNA and genealogy to create a family tree of possible identities. It was a long and arduous wait for investigators, but finally the results came back in from Parabon Nanolabs. In talking to Mercury News in November of 2018, Sheriff Lieutenant Julian Quinones said upon receiving Parabon's report, Sheriff's Office investigators continued to investigate the murder of Leslie Perloff. As a result, John Arthur Gertrude was identified as our suspect. Through careful observation of their suspect, the detectives were able to gain a sample of his DNA by sifting through his trash and finding a container he may have eaten or drank out of. This is called a discarded DNA sample. The sample was sent back to the lab for analysis against the sample collected from Leslie Perloff, and it was a match. The chances of it belonging to someone other than Gertrude is 1 in 65 septillions. Gertrude is a suspect in a slew of other cases, as well as having been convicted of 2 counts of rape and 1 of murder. Both sentences he served and was free once again soon after. His trial for the murder of Leslie Perloff is not set to begin until September of 2020. Number 3. On March 21, 1979, Barbara Becker's 2 sons, aged 7 and 9, returned home from school on what would have been a normal day for the 2 boys, but it quickly turned into a nightmare they would never forget. Barbara was found dead in the living room. She'd suffered injuries and had fought perilously with her attacker to save her life. There was a trail of blood leading out of the house, indicating that Barbara had managed to attack her killer in the fight, providing vital evidence in her investigation. The case remained cold, and for Barbara's 2 sons, it seemed like they may never get justice for their beautiful mother. That was until October 2018, when the FBI's investigative genealogical team became involved with Barbara's case. Much like the other cases mentioned in this episode, justice for Barbara came in the form of genealogical databases, a common theme among recently solved cases. The blood that the killer left behind proved to be vital. Barbara had put up a fight and in the process had helped law enforcement catch her killer. After many long months of hard work, the DNA led them to the relatives of one Paul Jean Chartrand. The relatives willingly gave DNA samples to investigators, and soon the match was confirmed. Paul Jean Chartrand was her killer. Sadly, Chartrand would never face justice for the brutal murder of the 37-year-old Barbara Becker in 1979, as he passed away in 1995, just months before the full implementation of CODIS. Number 2. In an unlikely turn of events, a cold case from 1991 has been solved by the use of a single sock. Denise Sharon Kolb was just 27 years old in 1991 when she was found murdered on November 12th of that same year. She was found wearing just a t-shirt, a jacket, and 1 pale yellow sock. Her death was ruled a homicide, with further details not being disclosed by the Delaware County Coroner's Office. This is where the yellow sock comes into play. Just 3 days after Denise was found, the apartment of her boyfriend, Theodore Donahue, was searched and investigators found the other yellow sock. Theodore admits that his nickname was Ted Bundy and even used Ted Bundy 1967 as his email address. Officials believe that she was murdered in her boyfriend's apartment before he moved her body to the wooded area where she would be discovered. Over the years, Theodore's actions have been more than suspicious. He would call the police and coroner's office asking about the autopsy results and offering his assistance in the case. While this might seem normal for a grieving loved one, Theodore sounded nervous and seemed like he had something to hide. Throughout many different interviews, Theodore's story changed ever so slightly each time. He even told a colleague at a pizza shop where he worked that Denise was found face down, naked with her legs spread and strangled, a detail that wasn't released publicly and only the killer would have known. The colleague also mentioned how Theodore was smiling when recalling the details. The biggest piece of evidence in Denise's case was the yellow sock found on her body that day. The case doesn't rely upon DNA or physical evidence, instead focusing heavily on the socks. Interview tapes and other pieces of evidence, such as witness accounts, played a part as well. On Tuesday, September 3, 2019, Theodore Dill Donahue was arrested and charged with murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and false reports to police. He's currently awaiting trial. Number 1. On July 21, 1999, A father and daughter were taking a walk along a secluded road in Raymond, Wisconsin, when they came across the body of an unidentified female. It was clear to the pair that the woman had suffered a horrific death. Due to her place of discovery, she became known as the Racine County Jane Doe, as investigators worked tirelessly to identify her and her killer. Her autopsy showed that she'd suffered a long period of neglect and abuse. She was littered with bruises and marks, was malnourished, and had untreated infections in her elbow. She had chemical burns as well, and road rash from being dragged around 25 feet to her final resting place. The abuse that Jane Doe suffered was brutal and incredibly graphic. She suffered a great deal of abuse and pain in her life, which only got worse in the days leading up to her death. Another indicator that she'd suffered long-term abuse was the fact that she developed a cauliflower ear. This is a deformity that happens when trauma is sustained to the ear over some time. To only add to the sadness of the Racine County Jane Doe, it was hypothesized that she possibly suffered from a cognitive disability and was likely killed by those who were meant to care for her and protect her. Many years passed with the citizens of Raymond, Wisconsin never forgetting about Jane Doe. Her funeral was held in 1999 with over 50 people turning up to pay their respects. Over the years, her body was exhumed for testing, but this didn't bring the investigation any closer to finding her identity or that of her killer. That was until November 8, 2019. The Racine County Police Department shocked the world when they revealed they finally knew the identity of the Racine County Jane Doe. She was 23-year-old Peggy Lynn Johnson from McHenry, Illinois. They left the public eye even more stunned when they revealed that not only did they know the identity of the doe, but the identity of her killer, Linda Sue LaRoche. When Peggy was just 18 years old, she lost her only surviving relative, her mother. With her father and brother already deceased, Peggy was homeless, alone, and scared. As hypothesized by investigators, Peggy did suffer from a cognitive disability, making the challenging time even harder for her. Peggy did what she thought was right and attended A&E at a local hospital. That's where she met Linda LaRoche, who immediately noticed Peggy's disability and used it to her advantage. She promised Peggy that she would be able to stay with the LaRoche family in exchange for her being a housekeeper, but instead, LaRoche subjected Peggy to unspeakable abuse and neglect. Peggy was finally identified after 20 long years through the use of genealogical DNA. Peggy was never reported missing as she had no family or friends who knew she was even gone. Linda LaRoche was arrested on November 5, 2019, after she confessed to neighbors in Cape Coral, Florida, that she'd killed someone back in 1999. Linda LaRoche is due to stand trial later this year. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads.